The morning sun cast long shadows across the military training ground as Sarah Martinez adjusted her uniform, one final time. At 23 years old, she stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, but her determination towered over most people around her. Today marked her final evaluation at the elite military academy, and she knew Colonel Harrison was watching her every move. Sarah had grown up in a small farming town where her father worked double shifts at the local factory while her mother cleaned houses to make ends meet. When Sarah announced her plan to join the military, her neighbors laughed. "A tiny girl like you?" they would say. "You belong in the kitchen, not on a battlefield." But Sarah had dreams bigger than their small minds could imagine. The academy had been brutal from day one. While other recruits complained about the early morning drills and endless push-ups, Sarah pushed herself harder. She woke up an hour before everyone else to practice combat moves she had learned from online videos. When others collapsed from exhaustion during the 20-mile marches, Sarah kept her legs moving and her head held high. Colonel Harrison had noticed her immediately, but not for the reasons Sarah hoped. A career military man with 30 years of service, he believed women had no place in combat roles. He had made it his personal mission to break Sarah's spirit and force her to quit. During her first week, he made her carry equipment twice her weight. When she succeeded, he doubled the punishment drills. When she excelled at those, he found new ways to humiliate her in front of the other soldiers. "Martinez!" Colonel Harrison's voice boomed across the training yard. "You think you're some kind of superhero because you can do a few push-ups?" The other recruits stopped their exercises and turned to watch. Sarah had learned that these public confrontations were Harrison's favorite weapon. He enjoyed having an audience when he tried to crush her confidence. Sarah stood at attention, her eyes focused straight ahead. She had perfected the art of looking respectful, while mentally preparing for whatever challenge he would throw at her next. Around them, nearly 500 soldiers had gathered for the morning assembly. The timing was perfect for Harrison's usual show. "I've been watching you, Martinez," Harrison continued, circling her like a predator. "You think you're proving something, but all I see is a stubborn little girl playing dress-up." His voice carried across the silent training ground. "Today we're going to settle this once and for all. You want to be treated like a real soldier? Then let's see if you can handle real combat." The challenge hung in the air like a storm cloud. Sarah knew this moment would define not just her military career, but everything she had worked toward. She thought about her parents, who had sacrificed so much to support her dreams. She thought about every girl back home who had been told she wasn't strong enough, fast enough, or tough enough to chase her ambitions. Colonel Harrison stepped closer, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Hand-to-hand combat, Martinez. Right here. Right now. If you can hold your own against me for 5 minutes, I'll recommend you for advanced training. If you can't..." He paused dramatically. "You pack your bags and go home where you belong." The crowd of soldiers pressed closer, forming a natural arena around Sarah and the colonel. Some looked excited at the prospect of entertainment, while others appeared uncomfortable with what was about to happen. Sarah could hear whispered bets being placed on how quickly Harrison would end the fight. As Sarah prepared herself mentally for the confrontation, she remembered her grandfather's words from years ago. He had been a boxer in his youth and taught her that real strength wasn't about size or muscle mass. "It's about heart," he had said. "It's about getting back up every time someone knocks you down. The person who wins isn't always the strongest, Sarah. Sometimes it's just the one who refuses to quit." The colonel rolled up his sleeves, revealing arms thick with muscle and scarred from decades of military service. He stood 6 feet 2 inches, tall and weighed at least twice as much as Sarah. To any observer, this looked like a mismatch of epic proportions, but Sarah had learned something important during her months at the academy. Underestimating your opponent was often the first step toward defeat. The morning air grew tense as the two fighters faced each other in the center of the makeshift ring. 500 pairs of eyes watched as David prepared to face Goliath, not with a sling and stone, but with courage and determination that had been forged through months of relentless training and unwavering belief in herself. Colonel Harrison cracked his knuckles as he sized up his opponent. The sound echoed across the silent training ground like breaking branches. He had been in hundreds of fights during his military career, from bar brawls in foreign countries to life-or-death combat situations. Never once had he faced an opponent who looked so small and seemingly helpless. Last chance to walk away with some dignity and tact. Harrison called out loud enough for everyone to hear. Nobody will think less of you for admitting you're not cut out for this. His words were meant to sound merciful, but Sarah could hear the mockery underneath. This was just another attempt to humiliate her before the real humiliation began. Guar took a deep breath and settled into the fighting stance her grandfather had taught her. She kept her feet slightly apart, her weight balanced and her hands ready but not clenched into fists yet. Around the circle, soldiers leaned forward to get a better view. Some were taking pictures with their phones, expecting to capture the moment when the tiny recruit got knocked to the ground. The first rule her grandfather had taught her was to watch your opponent's eyes, not their hands or feet. The eyes tell you everything, he had said. They tell you when someone's about to attack, when they're getting tired, and most importantly, when they're getting overconfident. As Sarah looked into Colonel Harrison's eyes, she saw exactly what she expected. Complete certainty that this would be over in seconds. Without warning, Harrison lunged forward with his right hand, throwing a punch that would have knocked most people unconscious. But Sarah had been expecting it. She ducked low and to the left, feeling the wind from his fist brush past her ear. The colonel's momentum carried him forward, and for just a moment he was off balance. Sarah didn't waste the opportunity. She drove her elbow upward into Harrison's ribs, putting all her weight behind the strike. The colonel grunted in surprise and stumbled backward. It wasn't enough to hurt him seriously, but it was enough to wipe the smug expression off his face. The crowd murmured in surprise. Nobody had expected the little recruit to land the first blow. Lucky shot, Harrison muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. But Sarah could see something change in his eyes. The absolute confidence was still there, but now it was mixed with a touch of caution. He had underestimated her once, and he wouldn't make that mistake again. The colonel began circling Sarah like a wolf stalking its prey. He was trying to use his size advantage to intimidate her, to make her feel trapped and helpless. Sarah turned with him, always keeping her face toward his, never letting him get behind her. She had learned this technique during countless hours of practice, fighting against opponents who were bigger and stronger than her. Harrison feinted left, then came in hard from the right. This time, Sarah was ready. She blocked his punch with her forearm and immediately countered with a quick jab to his solar plexus. Again, the colonel staggered backward, and again the crowd gasped in surprise. 2 hits in less than a minute. This wasn't going according to anyone's expectations. Fight. Back, you little coward! Harrison shouted, his face beginning to turn red with anger and embarrassment. Stop running around and fight like a soldier. But Sarah knew better than to let his words provoke her into making a mistake. Her grandfather had taught her that anger was a fighter's worst enemy. Stay calm, stay focused, and let your opponent make the mistakes, he had always said. The colonel's next attack was more desperate than strategic. He threw a wild haymaker that would have been devastating if it had connected, but Sarah saw it coming from a mile away. She ducked under his arm and pivoted behind him, landing a solid kick to the back of his knee. Harrison stumbled forward, barely keeping his balance. For the first time since the fight began, doubt crept into the colonel's mind. How was this tiny woman making him look foolish in front of his own soldiers? He had trained some of the toughest fighters in the military. He had survived combat in 3 different countries. Yet here he was, being outmaneuvered by someone who weighed less than his equipment bag. The crowd had grown completely silent now. What had started as entertainment was turning into something none of them had expected to witness. Some of the soldiers who had been betting against Sarah were beginning to look worried. Others were starting to smile, perhaps remembering their own encounters with the colonel's harsh training methods. Sarah could feel the momentum shifting in her favor, but she knew the most dangerous moment was still to come. A cornered animal fights hardest when it has nothing left to lose, and she could see that desperation building in Harrison's eyes. He was no longer fighting to teach her a lesson or prove a point. Now he was fighting to save face in front of his own troops. 3 minutes had passed since the fight began, and sweat was starting to bead on Colonel Harrison's forehead. He had never expected to be breathing hard against such a small opponent, but Sarah's speed and precision were wearing him down. Every time he thought he had her cornered, she would slip away like water through his fingers. The soldiers watching from the sidelines were no longer hiding their amazement. Conversations buzzed quietly through the crowd as they witnessed something that challenged everything they thought they knew about combat and strength. Some of the female recruits in the group were standing taller, their eyes bright with newfound hope and possibility. Sarah's strategy was working perfectly. Instead of trying to match the colonel's brute strength, she was using her speed and intelligence to frustrate him. She would dart in, land a quick strike, and then move away before he could retaliate. It was like watching a hummingbird fight a bear, and somehow the hummingbird was winning. "Stand still and fight," Harrison roared, his face now completely red, with exertion and embarrassment. His uniform was soaked with sweat, and his breathing had become labored. The man who had seemed so imposing just minutes ago now looked desperate and clumsy. This isn't how real soldiers fight. But Sarah knew she was fighting exactly how a real soldier should fight. She was using her brain instead of just her muscles. She was adapting to the situation instead of relying on outdated tactics. Most importantly, she was proving that heart and determination could overcome physical advantages. The turning point came when Harrison made his biggest mistake yet. Frustrated by his inability to land a solid hit, he decided to end the fight with one massive attack. He drew back his right leg, preparing to deliver a powerful kick that would send Sarah flying across the training ground. It was the kind of move that worked well against slower, less agile opponents, but it required perfect timing and balance. Sarah saw the kick coming and knew this was her moment. Instead of backing away as Harrison expected, she moved forward, getting inside the arc of his attack. The colonel's leg was already committed to the motion, and he couldn't change direction in mid-kick. Sarah grabbed his ankle with both hands and twisted hard to the right, using Harrison's own momentum against him. The result was devastating and immediate. Colonel Harrison's supporting leg couldn't handle the sudden change in direction combined with his full body weight. The sickening sound of bones breaking echoed across the training ground as his leg snapped below the knee. Harrison screamed in agony and crashed to the ground, his leg bent at an impossible angle. The crowd of soldiers gasped in horror and disbelief. In the space of 5 minutes, everything they thought they knew about their commanding officer had been turned upside down. The man who had seemed invincible was now writhing in pain on the ground, defeated by someone he had considered beneath his notice. Sarah immediately dropped to her knees beside the injured colonel. Despite everything he had put her through, her first instinct was to help him. She had won the fight, but she took no pleasure in seeing another person suffer. "Don't try to move," she said firmly but kindly. "Your leg is badly broken. We need to get you medical attention right away." "Get away from me," Harrison gasped through clenched teeth, his face twisted with pain and humiliation. "Don't you dare touch me." But even as he spoke, Sarah was already motioning for the other soldiers to call for a medic. Her actions spoke louder than any words about the kind of person she truly was. Lieutenant Colonel Peters, Harrison's second in command, pushed through the crowd and knelt beside his injured superior. Peters had been watching the entire fight, with a mixture of fascination and concern. He was a fair man who had never agreed with Harrison's treatment of female recruits, but military protocol had prevented him from speaking out. "Jesus, Harrison, what were you thinking?" Peters muttered as he examined the injury. The bone was clearly broken in multiple places, and Harrison's leg would require immediate surgery. It would be months before he could walk normally again, and his active military career was likely over. As the medical team arrived and began treating Colonel Harrison, Sarah stood quietly to the side. She felt no triumph, no satisfaction in her victory. She had proven her point, but at a terrible cost. Around her, 500 soldiers were trying to process what they had just witnessed. The strongest, most intimidating officer on the base had been brought down by the smallest recruit, and none of them would ever look at either combat or women the same way again. The ambulance sirens faded into the distance as Colonel Harrison was rushed to the base hospital. The training ground, which had been buzzing with excitement just moments before, now felt eerily quiet. 500 soldiers stood in small groups, talking in hushed voices about what they had just witnessed. Sarah found herself at the center of attention, but it wasn't the kind of attention she had wanted. Lieutenant Colonel Peters approached Sarah as she stood alone, still processing everything that had happened. Peters was a tall, lean man with kind eyes who had always been fair in his dealings with all the recruits. Unlike Harrison, he judged soldiers based on their abilities, rather than their gender or appearance. "Martinez," Peters said quietly, "I need you to come with me. We have some things to discuss." His tone wasn't angry or accusatory, but Sarah knew that serious consequences were coming. She had just severely injured a superior officer in front of hundreds of witnesses. Even though Harrison had challenged her to the fight, the military had strict rules about these situations. As they walked toward the administration building, Sarah could feel every pair of eyes following her movement. Some soldiers nodded respectfully as she passed, while others looked at her with a mixture of fear and amazement. She had become something of a legend in the span of 5 minutes, but legends often came with a heavy price. Inside Peter's office, Sarah stood at attention while he closed the door and sat behind his desk. The office was simple and functional, with military awards and commendations covering one wall. A picture of Peters with his wife and 2 daughters sat prominently on his desk, a reminder that even tough soldiers had families who loved them. "Ease, Martinez," Peters said, gesturing for her to sit in the chair across from his desk. "First, let me say that what I just witnessed was the most impressive display of tactical fighting I've seen in 20 years of military service. You used your opponent's strengths against him and never lost your composure under pressure." Sarah felt a surge of pride at the compliment, but she knew there was more to this conversation. "Thank you, sir," she replied simply, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Peters leaned back in his chair and studied Sarah's face. "However, we now have a serious situation to deal with. Colonel Harrison is in surgery right now and his injuries are severe. His military career is likely over, and there will be questions from high command about what happened here today." The weight of responsibility settled on Sarah's shoulders like a heavy blanket. She had won the fight and proven her point, but at what cost? A man's career was over, and she might face court-martial for injuring a superior officer, even in a sanctioned combat situation. "I want you to understand something," Peters continued. "Harrison brought this on himself. His treatment of you and other female recruits has been unprofessional and counterproductive. I've been documenting his behavior for months, waiting for the right opportunity to address it through proper channels." Sarah looked up in surprise. She hadn't known that anyone in the chain of command had been paying attention to Harrison's harassment. She had assumed she was fighting this battle completely alone. "What Harrison did today was completely inappropriate," Peters explained. "Challenging a recruit to combat as a form of hazing is against military regulations. He put you in an impossible situation where you had to choose between defending yourself and backing down from a superior officer's illegal order." The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. A young sergeant entered and handed Peters a folder marked "Urgent." Peters opened it and read quickly, his expression growing more serious with each line. "The base commander wants to see both of us immediately," Peters said, standing up and straightening his uniform. "General Morrison has heard about the incident and she's flying in from headquarters tomorrow morning for a full investigation." As they walked across the base toward the commander's office, Sarah's mind raced with possibilities. She could be discharged from the military, court-martialed, or worse. All of her dreams and hard work could disappear because of 5 minutes on a training ground. But as they passed groups of soldiers, Sarah noticed something that gave her hope. The female recruits she encountered stood a little straighter when they saw her. Some of the male soldiers who had previously ignored or dismissed her now nodded with genuine respect. Word of the fight was spreading throughout the base, and the story was growing with each telling. "Martinez," Peters said quietly as they approached the administration building, "whatever happens in the next few days, I want you to know that you've already changed things around here. That fight wasn't just about you proving yourself to Harrison. You've shown everyone on this base that strength comes in many different forms." The base commander's office loomed ahead, and Sarah knew that her future would be decided in the next few hours. But for the first time since joining the military, She felt like she wasn't fighting alone. The support of Lieutenant Colonel Peters and the respect she had earned from her fellow soldiers gave her strength to face whatever consequences awaited her. General Morrison arrived at the base the following morning like a storm front moving across the desert. She was a woman in her 50s who had risen through the ranks during a time when female officers faced even more challenges than they do today. Her reputation for fairness was matched only by her reputation for being absolutely ruthless when military regulations were violated. Sarah had spent a sleepless night in her barracks, replaying the fight over and over in her mind. Her fellow recruits had been surprisingly supportive, with several of them quietly expressing admiration for what she had accomplished. But support from peers couldn't protect her from the serious consequences she might face for injuring a superior. Officer, the investigation began at exactly 800 hours in the base conference room. General Morrison sat at the head of a long table, flanked by two officers Sarah didn't recognize. Lieutenant Colonel Peters sat to her right, while Sarah was positioned across from them, feeling very small and very alone despite Peters' reassurance. "Recruit Martinez," General Morrison began, her voice crisp and professional. "You are here to give testimony regarding yesterday's incident involving Colonel Harrison. You are not under arrest at this time, but you should understand that your answers may be used in future proceedings." Sarah straightened in her chair and looked directly at the general. "Yes, ma'am, I understand." "Tell me, in your own words, exactly what happened yesterday morning." Morrison's eyes never left Sarah's face as she spoke. The general had a way of looking at people that made them feel like she could see directly into their souls. Sarah recounted the events carefully and honestly, from Harrison's public challenge to the final moments when his leg snapped. She didn't try to make herself look heroic or minimize the severity of Harrison's injuries. The facts spoke for themselves, and she knew that any attempt to embellish or downplay the truth would only hurt her case. When Sarah finished her account, General Morrison turned to Lieutenant Colonel Peters. "Colonel Peters, you witnessed this entire incident. Do you corroborate Recruit Martinez's version of events?" "Yes, ma'am, completely," Peters replied without hesitation. "I would also like to add that Colonel Harrison's challenge to Recruit Martinez was completely inappropriate and against military regulations. He created a hostile environment and put a subordinate in an impossible position." General Morrison nodded slowly, then opened a thick folder in front of her. "I've been reviewing Colonel Harrison's file, and this incident appears to be part of a pattern of behavior. There have been multiple complaints about his treatment of female recruits, including documented incidents of verbal harassment and discriminatory training practices." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. She wasn't the only one who had experienced Harrison's hostile behavior, and apparently higher command had been aware of the problem for some time. However, Morrison continued, and Sarah's brief moment of relief evaporated. "The fact remains that a recruit injured a superior officer during what was supposed to be a training exercise. Regardless of the circumstances that led to the confrontation, we cannot ignore the serious nature of Colonel Harrison's injuries." The room fell silent as everyone waited for Morrison's next words. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears as she prepared for the verdict that would determine her future. "After reviewing all the evidence and consulting with the base legal team," Morrison said slowly, "I have determined that Recruit Martinez acted in self-defense during a situation that should never have occurred. Colonel Harrison exceeded his authority and created a dangerous situation through his inappropriate challenge." Sarah felt like she could breathe again for the first time in 24 hours, but Morrison wasn't finished speaking. "That being said, the military cannot function if recruits and officers are settling disputes through physical combat. Therefore, Recruit Martinez, you will face a formal disciplinary hearing where all the facts will be presented to a review board. However, I am recommending that you be allowed to continue your training while this process takes place." The decision was better than Sarah had dared to hope for. She would face consequences, but her military career wasn't over. She would have the opportunity to defend her actions before a fair tribunal, and most importantly, she could continue working toward her goals. Furthermore, General Morrison added, "I am ordering a complete review of training procedures at this facility. The kind of harassment and intimidation that led to yesterday's incident will not be tolerated in my command. As the meeting concluded, General Morrison approached Sarah personally. "Recruit Martinez, what you did yesterday was extraordinary, but I hope you understand that violence should always be a last resort. Your real victory wasn't breaking Harrison's leg. It was showing everyone on this base that determination and skill matter more than size or gender." That evening, as Sarah walked across the base to the dining hall, she noticed a change in how people looked at her. The mixture of fear and amazement from the day before had evolved into something that looked more like genuine respect. Female. Recruits who had previously avoided making eye contact now approached her to ask for training advice. Even some of the male soldiers who had initially dismissed her were now treating her as an equal. 6 months later, Sarah Martinez stood at attention as Lieutenant Colonel Peters pinned the Distinguished Training Award to her uniform. The same training ground where she had faced Colonel Harrison was now filled with families and dignitaries who had come to watch the graduation ceremony for her class. The disciplinary hearing had concluded 3 months earlier with Sarah receiving only a formal reprimand for her role in the incident. The review board had determined that Harrison's actions constituted harassment and that Sarah had acted within her rights to defend herself when physically threatened by a superior officer. More importantly, the hearing had led to significant changes in how the military handled complaints of discrimination and harassment. Colonel Harrison had recovered from his injuries, but had been forced into early retirement. His leg had healed, but not well enough for active duty, and the investigation into his behavior had revealed a pattern of discrimination that could no longer be ignored. In a strange twist of fate, his attempt to break Sarah's spirit had instead broken his own career. As Sarah looked out at the crowd of spectators, she spotted her parents in the third row. Her father wore his best suit, the same one he had worn to her high school graduation, and her mother clutched a small bouquet of flowers with tears streaming down her face. They had driven 18 hours to be here, and Sarah could see the pride radiating from their faces. The changes at the base had been dramatic and immediate. Lieutenant Colonel Peters had been promoted to full colonel and had implemented new training protocols that emphasized skill and determination over physical intimidation. The number of female recruits had increased by 40%, and more importantly, their completion rate had improved significantly. Sarah had become something of a mentor to the newer female recruits, teaching them the same lessons her grandfather had taught her about using intelligence and determination to overcome physical disadvantages. She discovered that she had a natural talent for instruction, and several of her students had gone on to excel in advanced training programs. During her final evaluation, Colonel Peters had pulled Sarah aside for a private conversation. "Martinez," he had said, "you've shown exceptional leadership potential throughout your training. I'm recommending you for officer candidate school. The military needs leaders who understand that strength comes in many different forms." The recommendation had been approved, and Sarah would be starting officer training in 2 weeks. The girl, who had been told she belonged in the kitchen, was now on track to become a commissioned officer in the United States military. As the graduation ceremony concluded and families began to mingle with the new graduates, Sarah found herself approached by a young woman who couldn't have been more than 18 years old. She was small in stature, just like Sarah, and her nervous expression was familiar. "Excuse me, ma'am," the young woman said hesitantly. "I'm supposed to start training here next month, and I wanted to thank you. My recruiter told me about what happened with Colonel Harrison, and it gave me the courage to follow through with my enlistment. I was getting scared that I wasn't tough enough for military life." Sarah smiled and shook the young woman's hand. "What's your name?" "Jessica Torres, ma'am. I'm from a small town in Texas where most people think girls should stick to traditional jobs. But I want to serve my country, and your story showed me that it's possible." Looking at Jessica, Sarah saw herself from a year ago, scared but determined, small but unbreakable, facing a world that didn't believe in her potential. The cycle was continuing, and Sarah realized that her real victory hadn't been defeating Harrison in combat. Her real victory was proving that one person's courage could inspire others to chase their own dreams. "Jessica," Sarah said, "let me give you the same advice my grandfather gave me. Your size doesn't determine your strength, your heart does. Work twice as hard as everyone else. Never let anyone convince you that you don't belong. And remember that every challenge is just an opportunity to prove what you're made of." As the sun set over the military base, Sarah Martinez looked back on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The girl who had faced ridicule in her small hometown had become a leader and inspiration to others. The fight with Colonel Harrison had lasted only 5 minutes, but its impact would last for generations of female soldiers who would follow in her footsteps. The colonel had tried to kick her down, convinced that his size and authority would crush her spirit. Instead, his own career had snapped under the weight of his prejudice and arrogance. Sarah had learned that true strength wasn't about dominating others, but about lifting them up and showing them what was possible when courage met determination. Years later, when Sarah had achieved the rank of major and was commanding her own unit, she would still remember that morning on the training ground. Not because of the violence or the dramatic ending, but because it marked the moment when she stopped fighting for acceptance and started fighting for change. And that fight, she knew, was far from over.